July 1929, Montreal Locomotive works. A locomotive rolls out of the assembly hall that shouldn't exist. Not in Canada, not in the British Empire. 10 driving wheels, 63 inches each, a boiler the size of a tunnel boring through mountain granite. Weight, 375 short tons, fully loaded. Tractive effort, 77,200 pounds with another 12,000 waiting in the booster engine, mounted to the trailing truck. The Americans had their Big Boys, their Alleghenies, their Yellowstones, articulated giants that made headlines and broke records. Everyone knew those names. But this? This was something else, a simple, non-articulated brute designed for one purpose, to drag freight and passengers through 262 miles of the most punishing railroad territory on the continent. They called it the Selkirk, and for 30 years it would prove that size isn't everything, geography is. What happens when you build the most powerful locomotive in an entire empire not to set records but to survive? The problem was Rogers Pass. In 1881, when the Canadian Pacific Railway set out to bind a nation together with steel, they faced terrain that should have stopped them dead. The Selkirk Mountains in southeastern British Columbia rose like serrated knives between Calgary and the Pacific coast. Grades climbed at 2.2%, 1 foot of elevation for every 45 feet of track. Curves twisted at 12 degrees, radii so tight they measured just 480 feet. Avalanches roared down slopes without warning. Winter snows buried entire trains. The CPR had pushed through anyway because there was no choice. Confederation demanded a railroad to the Pacific, so they carved snowsheds, blasted tunnels, erected bridges over gorges that dropped hundreds of feet. They completed the transcontinental line in 1885 with a last spike driven at Craigellachie, and, for a while, brute determination compensated for inadequate locomotives. But determination has limits. By the 1920s, traffic was choking the line. Freight tonnage climbed, passenger service expanded. The existing 2 8-nil consolidations and older power struggled over the grades, requiring double heading and helper operations that slowed everything to a crawl. Trains over 1,050 tons had to be cut in half at Field or Revelstoke, run separately, then reassembled. Helper engines pushed from Revelstoke west to the Y at Taft, 23 backbreaking miles up a constant grade, before uncoupling and running back down empty. The CPR's competitors weren't sitting idle. Canadian National Railway was running larger locomotives via Yellowhead Pass with grades half as steep. One GTP locomotive could haul 2,041 tons from Edmonton to Prince Rupert, 4 times what CPR could manage over the mountains. The Panama Canal had opened in 1914, offering shippers an alternative route. If CPR couldn't move tonnage efficiently through the Selkirks, the railway would lose its lifeblood. Something had to change, not just bigger, not just stronger. The locomotive needed to be specific. Built for curves that would derail a longer articulated engine. Built for grades that demanded pulling power at low speed. Built for oil firing in a region where coal was expensive and water stops few. Built, above all, to function in conditions that would cripple anything designed for flatland railroading. In 1928, Henry Bowen, the CPR's chief mechanical engineer, began working with Montreal Locomotive Works on a design. They settled on the 210 4-wheel arrangement, called a Texas type in the United States, where it had proven successful for heavy drag service. 10 coupled driving wheels would distribute weight and maximize tractive effort. A 4-wheel trailing truck would support a massive firebox capable of generating the steam needed for sustained mountain work. But this wouldn't be a Texas. This would be a Selkirk. The first 20 emerged from Montreal Locomotive Works between July and December 1929, bearing numbers 52900 through 5919. Class T1A, they weighed 375 short tons when fully loaded, engine, water and oil combined. The boiler operated at 275 pounds per square inch. Cylinders measured 25 inches in diameter with a 32-inch stroke, driving those 10 63-inch wheels with punishing force. The result? 77,200 pounds of tractive effort, more than any simple locomotive in the British Empire. With the booster engine engaged, the number jumped to 90,000 pounds. They were oil burners, unusual for the time and place. Eastern Canada ran on coal, but oil was practical in the mountains, cleaner, easier to handle in sub-zero temperatures, more responsive to the demands of grade work. Tender carried 12,000 imperial gallons of water and 4,100 imperial gallons of fuel oil. That tender was so heavy, 148 short tons, that it required two 6-wheel trucks instead of the standard 4-wheel design. The T100s had no streamlining, no Art Deco flourishes, no polished panels or decorative trim. They looked like what they were, heavy iron built for heavy work. Soot-blackened, utilitarian, intimidating. The kind of machine that didn't need to look fast because it was never going to be fast. It just needed to pull. And pull they did. The Selkirks were assigned to the Calgary-Revelstoke run, 262 miles through the heart of the Canadian Rockies. The eastern portion, the Lagan subdivision, covered 137 miles and included the notorious Field Hill and the spiral tunnels, where the track looped back on itself to gain elevation without exceeding grade limits. The western portion, the mountain subdivision, covered the remaining 126 miles and included Rogers Pass, the Connaught Tunnel bored beneath it, and the Stony Creek Bridge, a steel trestle spanning a chasm so deep you could drop a 10-story building into it. Grades maxed out at 2.2%, curves tightened to 480-foot radii. In winter, temperatures plunged to 40 below. Snowdrifts buried the rails. Avalanches turned the pass into a killing ground. In 1910, one slide had struck a work crew, clearing snow, killing 62 men. The Connaught Tunnel, completed in 1916, had bypassed the worst of it, but the mountains didn't forgive mistakes. The Selkirks handled it. On the lesser grades, a single Selkirk could haul 1,050 short tons unassisted, no booster, no helpers. That was double what the older consolidations managed. On steeper sections, crews cut in the booster and kept moving. The big oil-fired boiler delivered consistent steam even at low speeds where coal-fired engines often struggled to maintain pressure. The firebox, fed automatically by a mechanical stoker, didn't care how steep the grade was, it just burned hotter. Crews loved them for their power, crews hated them for their cab layout. The cabs on the T1As weren't insulated well, and mountain winters were brutal. At speed, wind knifed through gaps around the windows. At low speed, climbing grades with the throttle wide open, heat from the firebox turned the cab into a sweatbox. You froze or you roasted. There was no middle ground, but they were reliable. That mattered more than comfort. In 1938, Montreal Locomotive Works delivered 10 more Selkirks, this time with improvements. Class T1B, numbers 5920 through 5929. The modifications were subtle but significant. Boiler pressure increased from 275 to 285 psi, wringing more power from the same basic design. Cylinder diameter dropped by ½ an inch to compensate, keeping tractive effort roughly equal, while reducing weight by 10 tons. The T1Bs weighed less, ran hotter, and lasted longer between shop visits. More importantly, they looked different. The T1Bs carried semi-streamlined casings inspired by the CPR's famous Royal Hudson passenger locomotives. Smooth metal panels wrapped the smokebox. The running boards gained decorative Tuscan red panels trimmed in gold leaf, later changed to a yellow, similar to Dulux gold. Classification lights at the front took on a teardrop shape. The engines still weren't pretty. Nothing hauling ore and grain through mountain passes could be pretty, but they had presence. The streamlining wasn't cosmetic vanity, it was marketing. CPR wanted passengers to see these machines and feel confidence. The Selkirks handled both freight and passenger trains, and a passenger climbing aboard at Calgary needed to believe the locomotive pulling them through avalanche country and tunnels 5 miles long could be trusted. The streamlining worked, sort of. It also created maintenance headaches. Snow and ice built up in the cowlings. Accessing components for repair required removing panels that hadn't been designed for easy removal. After a few winters, shop crews stopped caring about aesthetics and just did what worked. Still, the T1Bs performed. They ran the same brutal route as the T1As, and they did it with slightly less fuel consumption and slightly more availability. In a business where every ton-mile mattered and every hour of downtime cost money, those slight improvements added up. Then came the war. World War II transformed North American railroading overnight. Freight traffic surged, military shipments clogged the lines, passenger service expanded to move troops and workers to coastal defense installations. Every locomotive the CPR owned ran flat out, and the Selkirks ran hardest of all because the Selkirk Mountains didn't offer alternatives. The T1As and T1Bs held up, but barely. Maintenance intervals compressed. Boilers that should have been pulled for inspection stayed in service. Running gear wore faster than it could be rebuilt. By 1945, the entire class showed its age. The CPR didn't order replacements during the war. No one did, with production controlled by government allocation. But in 1949, with the war over and traffic still heavy, Montreal Locomotive Works delivered 6 final Selkirks, Class T1C, numbers 5930 through 5935. These were the last standard-gauge steam locomotives built in Canada for a Canadian railway. That fact alone makes them historically significant. But the T1Cs also represented the peak of Selkirk development. Everything the CPR had learned in 20 years of mountain railroading distilled into 6 machines. The improvements were incremental, but meaningful. 2 cross-compound air compressors replaced the single units on earlier classes, speeding up air brake recharging, critical for long freight trains descending mountain grades where braking meant survival. Some streamlining details disappeared. The smokebox casing vanished. Classification lights lost their teardrop shape. Function trumped form. The cabs, however, got worse. The T1Cs weren't insulated like the earlier classes. The reasoning was economic. Insulation added weight and cost, and by 1949 CPR knew steam's days were numbered. Diesels were coming. Why invest in cold weather comfort for locomotives that might only run another decade? The crews noticed. Engineers and firemen who'd worked the earlier Selkirks cursed the T1Cs in winter. Cold bit harder, wind cut deeper, but the engine still pulled, and that's what mattered. For a while. Dieselization arrived in the early 1950s, not gradually, not gently, like a guillotine. Diesel-electric locomotives didn't need water, didn't need massive tenders, didn't need turntables or roundhouses or the infrastructure steam demanded. They could run back-to-back, multiple units controlled from a single cab, multiplying power without multiplying crew. They didn't slip on grades, they didn't need helper operations, they just worked efficiently and relentlessly. Between 1950 and 1952, diesels began operation between Calgary and Revelstoke. The Selkirks, the pride of the mountain subdivisions, found themselves reassigned. They moved east to the Brooks and Maple Creek subdivisions, running between Calgary and Swift Current, Saskatchewan, flat prairie work, the kind of service they'd never been designed for. Some hauled freight north to Edmonton. A few received an all-black paint scheme, stripping away the Tuscan, red panels and leaving only the yellow trim as a ghost of former glory. It was like exiling a mountain climber to a treadmill. They still worked, they still pulled tonnage, but the fire was gone. These were machines built to conquer geography, now reduced to hauling grain across terrain that didn't fight back. By 1957, The class was rated at 50 mph, a speed restriction that acknowledged their age and condition. Former crews recalled running them at 65 mph before the limitation, back when they were young and the mountains demanded everything they had. In 1959, the last Selkirks, numbers 5930 through 5935, the T1Cs, the final standard gauge steam locomotives built in Canada, were taken out of service. 34 went to the scrapper's torch, melted down, sold as raw metal. Their driving wheels, each one a precision-machined circle of steel that had climbed countless grades, became rebar and pipe fittings. Their boilers, which had generated millions of pounds of steam under mountain skies, vanished into furnaces. Only 2 survived. Number 5935 went to the Canadian Railway Museum in Saint-Constant, Quebec. Number 5931 was preserved at Heritage Park in Calgary, Alberta. For display purposes, it was repainted and intentionally renumbered as 5934, a cosmetic choice that confused historians for decades. Both are T1C class. The last of the line, none of the T1A locomotives survived, not one. Those 20 machines, the originals, the beasts that proved the concept, the engines that first conquered Rogers Pass with 90,000 pounds of booster-assisted fury, all gone. None of the T1B class survived either. The 10 semi-streamlined engines that ran passenger trains through the spiral tunnels and across the Stony Creek Bridge, gone. We're left with 2 examples of the final, least loved class, preserved not because they were the best, but because they were the last. So what about the claim, the title, the assertion that these locomotives outpulled every American steam engine? It's not quite true. The Selkirks, with booster engaged, maxed out at 90,000 pounds of tractive effort. That's formidable, that's British Empire leading, but it's not world-beating. American articulated locomotives crushed that number. The Union Pacific Big Boy, 135 cc, 375 pounds. The Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny, 110,211 pounds. The Duluth, Misabe and Iron Range. Yellowstone, 140,093 pounds. Even among non-articulated 2 TD10, TD4s, the Selkirk's direct competitors, some American designs exceeded them. The Bessemer and Lake Erie H1 class produced 102,006 pounds of tractive effort. The C&O's T1 Texas type around 98,000 pounds. The Selkirks weren't the strongest. They weren't the biggest. They weren't even the most powerful simple locomotives on the continent. But they were the most powerful locomotives in the British Empire. And they were built for a job that American superpower couldn't handle, navigating 480-foot radius curves while pulling 1,000 tons up a 2.2% grade in sub-zero temperatures through tunnels 5 miles long with avalanche debris littering the track. The Big Boy couldn't do that. Too long, too rigid. It would have derailed on the first curve out of field. The Allegheny couldn't do that. Too heavy. The bridges between Golden and Revelstoke had to be reinforced just to handle the Selkirks, and Allegheny would have put them in the river. The Yellowstone couldn't do that, too specialized for ore service, too brutish for dual freight and passenger work. The Selkirks weren't built to outpull America's giants in a straight-line test. They were built to survive where those giants couldn't even run. Geography is the cruelest judge of engineering, and the Selkirks passed every test the Selkirk Mountains could devise for 30 years. In 1988, the Canadian Pacific Railway opened the Mount Macdonald Tunnel, 9.1 miles long, the longest railway tunnel in the Americas. It runs beneath the same mountains the Selkirks once climbed over. Westbound traffic uses the new tunnel. Eastbound still uses the old Connaught Tunnel, completed in 1916. The grades are easier now, the curves are gentler. Diesel locomotives haul trains that would have required 3 Selkirks and a helper. The work is efficient, predictable, profitable, but something's missing. Stand at Heritage Park in Calgary and look at number 5931. The paint is fresh, The brass is polished, the boiler will never fire again. It sits silent, preserved, a monument to an era when machines were built not for records but for reality. When most powerful meant nothing if you couldn't negotiate a 12-degree curve, when engineering wasn't about bragging rights but about getting grain to Vancouver and passengers to Banff without killing them on Rogers Pass. The Selkirks didn't outpull every American steam engine. They did something better. They won, not against other locomotives, against the mountains, against winter, against economics that said the Canadian Pacific Railway couldn't possibly operate a transcontinental line through terrain that brutal. For 30 years they proved otherwise. What other stories are we forgetting because they weren't the biggest, the fastest, the strongest? What other machines deserve remembering, not for breaking records, but for doing the impossible work no one else wanted? The Selkirks are gone, mostly. 2 remain silent, waiting, and the mountains they conquered still stand, indifferent to the steel that once challenged them. What do you think? Are we measuring greatness by the right standards, or are we missing the real stories hidden in the forgotten corners of history?